Let's talk about our own great leader from Ghana. His name is Kwame Nkrumah. Sit tight and listen. In the quiet, humid village of Nkrumah, in 1935, he was 26 years old and practically penniless. The bustling streets of New York City, with its towers of steel and smoke, were a world away from the quiet paths of Nkrumah. But he had not come for comfort. He had come to arm himself with ideas. He believed knowledge was power, and he intended to return to Africa wielding both. He enrolled at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, one of the oldest historically black universities in the United States. It was a place that had nurtured the minds of African and African-American leaders, and here Nkrumah found the intellectual fire he had been searching for. He studied economics, sociology, and theology. He read everything he could get his hands on: Karl Marx, Lenin, Hegel, Marcus Garvey, and the Bible. He also swept floors, worked as a dishwasher, and even shined shoes to pay his fees. His poverty was deep, but so was his determination. It was in America that Kwame Nkrumah's identity as a Pan-Africanist began to solidify. The racial oppression he witnessed in the United States reminded him of the colonial oppression in Africa. He drew parallels between the struggles of African Americans and Africans under British rule. He became close to professors and activists who were part of the global Black liberation movement. Among his greatest influences was the Pan-Africanist writer and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who emphasized the importance of African unity and self-determination. At Lincoln, Nkrumah became president of the African Students Association and later earned degrees in both economics and education. But he didn't stop there. He went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where he pursued a master's degree in philosophy and continued studying political science and sociology. By the time he left the US in 1945, Nkrumah had spent over a decade immersed in the ideas that would shape a continent. But Kwame was not just a scholar. He was a natural organizer, a passionate orator, and a deeply spiritual man. He preached in black churches on Sundays, often linking scripture to the liberation of Africa. He believed that spiritual salvation and political freedom were intertwined. His charisma grew, as did his conviction that Africa needed not just reform, but revolution. That revolution, he believed, would come through Pan-Africanism, a united front of all African peoples, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. This belief took him across the Atlantic again, this time to London in 1945. There, he joined forces with George Padmore, a Trinidadian Marxist and one of the leading Pan-African theorists of the time. The two became close allies and co-organizers of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. That Congress was a turning point. Attended by African and Caribbean intellectuals, trade unionists and activists, including future leaders like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Hastings Banda of Malawi, it declared that colonial rule must end and that Africa's future would be shaped by Africans. Nkrumah emerged from the Congress not just as a speaker, but as a leader, a man whose vision for Africa was becoming sharper and more urgent. But vision alone was not enough. Kwame Nkrumah knew it was time to return to the land of his birth. He had the knowledge, he had the connections, he had the fire. What he needed now was a platform. In 1947, after more than 12 years abroad, Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast. He stepped off the plane with worn shoes, a briefcase filled with books and speeches, and a heart burning with purpose. He was coming home not as a teacher, but as a liberator. The storm of African independence was about to begin, and he would be its thunder. When Kwame Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast in late 1947, his homeland was a colony simmering with discontent. The people were weary of British rule. Prices were rising, jobs were scarce, and African soldiers who had fought in World War II came back to a nation that still treated them as second-class citizens. The winds of change were beginning to stir, and Nkrumah walked into them like a man stepping into destiny. He was quickly invited to join the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, a political organization formed by educated African elites who wanted self-government in the shortest possible time. The UGCC, led by J.B. Dankwa and other intellectuals, recognized Nkrumah's fiery charisma and organizational talent. They appointed him as General Secretary, and almost immediately he began traveling across the country, organizing branches, galvanizing the youth, and electrifying the masses. But it soon became clear that Nkrumah's radical vision went far beyond the cautious, elite-led agenda of the UGCC. Where they sought gradual reform, he demanded immediate self-rule. Where they appealed to British civility, he stirred the souls of market women, dock workers, and young nationalists with a vision of total freedom. In 1948, everything changed. A peaceful protest by ex-servicemen in Accra turned violent when colonial police opened fire, killing 3 unarmed veterans. Riots broke out across the colony. British authorities blamed the UGCC and arrested its leaders, including Nkrumah. His few weeks in prison turned him into a hero. When he was released, his popularity had exploded. By 1949, Nkrumah had broken away from the UGCC. He launched his own movement, the Convention People's Party, CPP. His message was bold and uncompromising: self-government now. He toured the country relentlessly, speaking in markets, churches, schools, and open fields. He formed women's groups, youth leagues, and labor unions. He spoke not just to the educated, but to the ordinary farmer, the fisherman, the seamstress. He made them believe they could change their fate. In January 1950, Nkrumah launched the Positive Action Campaign, a strategy of strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience to pressure the British colonial administration. The response was swift. He and other CPP leaders were arrested again, but once more, prison only elevated his image. As he sat behind bars, the CPP grew stronger. In 1951, the British reluctantly agreed to hold democratic elections under a new constitution. The result was a landslide. Even from prison, Nkrumah's popularity was unstoppable. The CPP won 34 of the 38 elected seats in the Legislative Assembly. The colonial government had no choice but to release him. He was freed to the cheers of thousands and appointed leader of government business, effectively the colony's first prime minister. It was a historic moment. For the first time, power was shifting into African hands, not through the barrel of a gun, but through the will of the people. Over the next 6 years, Nkrumah governed with energy and vision. He pushed for more control over internal affairs, improved education, infrastructure, and industry. He faced opposition from conservatives, from the British, and even from within his own country, but he would not be moved. His eyes were set on a higher goal, full independence. Negotiations with Britain intensified. Nkrumah skillfully walked a fine line, demanding freedom but avoiding violent revolution. Finally, his dream came true. On the 6th of March 1957, the world watched as the Gold Coast became the independent nation of Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to break colonial rule. Nkrumah stood before a sea of people in Black Star Square and declared with tears in his eyes, "At long last the battle has ended, and thus Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." The cheers echoed across the continent. Africa had found its torchbearer. The journey from the dusty roads of Nkroful to the golden heights of independence had been long, but Kwame Nkrumah had arrived. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a flame, a prophecy fulfilled. By the early 1950s, the Gold Coast was vibrating with anticipation. The winds of change were no longer whispers. They were howling through the colonial corridors. At the center stood Kwame Nkrumah, a man transformed from prisoner to prime ministerial leader. But he had only one goal in sight: complete independence, not in pieces, not in promises, but in full. Once released from prison in 1951, Nkrumah led the Convention People's Party, CPP, into government with overwhelming support. He was appointed leader of government business and later Prime Minister, a title still subordinate to British authority. But under his leadership, the Gold Coast began to look less like a colony and more like a nation. He launched widespread reforms. New roads, schools, and hospitals were built. The foundations of modern industry and agriculture were laid. Nkrumah expanded free education and insisted on training a new generation of Ghanaians to manage their own country. The masses adored him. He didn't govern from ivory towers. He toured the country constantly, meeting farmers, listening to market women, addressing students. To the people, he was not just a politician. He was a savior. But independence was not merely a domestic matter. Nkrumah used diplomacy, media, and mass mobilization to pressure the British. In London, colonial officials watched nervously as his popularity surged and his demands sharpened. He was no longer asking politely. He was declaring a deadline. On 6th March 1957, the impossible became real. Before a roaring crowd at the old polo grounds in Accra, Kwame Nkrumah stood beneath the stars and thundered words that would echo for generations. "At long last the battle has ended, and thus Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." The Gold Coast had become Ghana, named after the ancient empire that once ruled West Africa, a symbol of African glory and rebirth. It was the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule. Across the continent and around the world, people watched in awe. Africa had its beacon and Nkrumah was its light, but Nkrumah's vision was never just about Ghana. That very night he warned, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent." He saw Ghana as a seed from which African unity would bloom. He believed the continent must not only be free, but united, a single continent with a common destiny. He began hosting African liberation fighters, offering them funds, passports, and support. Leaders from Algeria to Zimbabwe found in Ghana a home. In 1960, Ghana held a referendum and declared itself a republic. Nkrumah became the nation's first president, now with executive powers. He moved into Flagstaff House, but power did not dull his revolutionary zeal. If anything, it grew more ambitious. He launched massive infrastructure projects: the Akosombo Dam, designed to electrify the nation, state-run industries, a modern port in Tema, new universities. He dreamed of transforming Ghana into an industrial powerhouse, a black star shining bright for the world. But the path he chose was not without shadows. As he tightened control, opposition parties were banned, the press was censored, and critics were jailed. He believed that unity required discipline, and discipline meant silencing dissent. Many began to whisper that Nkrumah had replaced one form of oppression with another. But to him, the stakes were too high for distraction. Ghana had to succeed, or Africa's hope would dim. He moved deeper into Pan-African diplomacy, founding the Organization of African Unity in 1963. He pushed for a continental government, a shared currency, a joint army. His book, Africa Must Unite, became a blueprint for continental revolution. But many leaders, still guarding their young sovereignties, were not ready for Nkrumah's bold vision. Still, he marched on. By the mid-1960s, Nkrumah was no longer just Ghana's president. He was the voice of Africa's dream. Statues of him were erected, and schoolchildren chanted his name. But behind the applause, the earth beneath him was beginning to crack. We have to stop our first episode here. We will notify you before the episode 2 will be released. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Got thoughts or questions? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.